Hello everyone, Remix Review Guy here. I review remixes. It's the last month of 2024, so I'm going to try and clean up a few notable albums from this year that I haven't got around to reviewing yet. And today, it's time for the big one. I've put it off for long enough, but I am finally reviewing the most talked about remix album of 2024.
Brat!
And it's completely different, but also Still
Brat.
Oh, that makes sense.
Brat.
I'm a little late to the party with this one, not because I didn't want to review it, but because honestly, I feel kind of ill-equipped to review it. There's already been a lot of reviews, reactions and think pieces about this album from people who have been pretty deeply invested in the lore of XCX's work for a long time, whereas I am very much a newbie to her work. But this is a review I very much have to do because I can't be a remix review guy if I don't try and form an opinion on this. This isn't just the biggest remix album of the year by a country mile. It might end up being the biggest remix album of the decade. What else comes close in the last 5 years? The most well-publicised remix album in 2023 was Paramore, and that didn't have a transatlantic campaign revealing the names of remixes via strategically placed billboards. Hey look, Zane Lowe is coming to Wisconsin. Nor did Paramore's remix album have a season named after it. Is everyone ready for This Is Winter? Now, I'll be honest here, if you're looking for a big breakdown of all the lore that's gone into this remix album, that isn't going to be my strong suit. What I have noticed from other reviews, though, is that many of them seem to come from a place of the reviewer being like,
it's very rare that remix albums are good, or that I go into a remix album with super high expectations.
I, on the other hand, am looking at Still Brat from the perspective of an avid remix fan, and one with a pretty open-minded attitude towards remixes, if I do say so myself. So in this review, I'm going to look at how this remix package fits into the wider world of remix culture, and given the influence that XCX now wields, what this potentially means for the future of remixing. First though, I need to acquaint myself with Brat.
You always say let's go out, so we go eat at a restaurant sometimes.
So, cards on the table, prior to Brat, I can only really remember hearing two Charli XCX songs in full. One of them was Nuclear Seasons, for which I saw the music video around a friend's house party in 2012. I quite liked it in that early 10s pitchfork-pleasing synthwave kind of way. The other Charli song I was familiar with was the one she did with Icona Pop. I love it. I'm not going to pretend I understand everything about modern pop music, but I think I can tell which of these directions Charli has chosen to embrace more in her subsequent work. At its heart, Brat is the album that Charli wanted to make for herself, not worrying about record executives telling her what to do. The aim was simply to make an album that XCX fans can enjoy. At least that's what she claims. In her interview with famous Paramore remixer Zane Lowe, Charli talks about how she loaded the album with details specifically aimed at her fan base for them to unpack and enjoy, and yet it's an album that has attracted a lot of new fans in the process.
I would say sort of like 95% of people who were engaging with my work were so hungry to explore all of the kind of little Easter eggs and the depth behind everything that I was doing, and now there's, more people who are engaging with things on a surface level, which is totally great. But I'm the artist in me is like, oh, but don't you know why I wore that colour? Getting like.
I think she might be talking about me. Brat has effectively been my official intro to Charli XCX, and for all the talk about it being a fan service album, I feel like I already learnt a lot about who Charli XCX is as a person from the songs in this album. The main crux of the album is that Charli is a party girl.
When I go to the club, I wanna hear those club classics.
And yet, she's not always that comfortable with being a party girl.
'Cause I don't know if I belong here anymore.
She's brash and a show-off, but she's also aware of the trappings and difficulty that fame brings.
I'd go back in time to when I wasn't insecure, to when I didn't overanalyze my face shape.
Trying to talk to a potential partner can leave her somewhat tongue-tied.
I followed you to the bathroom, but then I felt crazy.
She has a lot of mixed feelings about her contemporaries.
Some girl taps my insecurities.
Not necessarily hatred, but not necessarily comfortable with them either.
Yeah, I don't know if you like me. Sometimes I think you might hate me. Sometimes I think I might hate you.
She has, let's say, a bit of a complicated relationship with her family. She gives a lot of shout outs to producers in her songs, so she's not above admitting that she's had a lot of help along the way.
I wanna dance to AG, I wanna dance with George, I wanna dance to Sophie, I wanna dance to Hub Mo.
And in the case of her closest collaborators, she feels like she hasn't always treated them as well as she should have.
Why did I push you away? I was scared sometimes.
So effectively, Charli XCX is relatable, well-rounded, more nuanced than the average pop star, possibly. So even though she does express frustration that the new fans she's gained from this album are missing out on some of the underlying subtleties and references in what she does, this album nonetheless works very well as an entry point into Charli's world. And to be honest, I don't necessarily think this is by accident. A lot of this just comes from XCX's attitude towards lyrics and delivery. Lyrically, she is pretty direct. There's a few moments of obliqueness here and there, but it's generally pretty easy to understand what Charli is saying in these songs. You're not going to mistake the meaning of a song like I Think About It All the Time, for example.
That I might run out of time, but I finally met my baby, and a baby might be mine.
It's quite clearly about Charli mulling over whether she's ready for motherhood at this stage in her life.
Or maybe it's a sequel to the Ace of Base song. Not sure.
And yet, I don't come away from these songs thinking, well, there's no subtext here, so what's the point? Part of this, I think, is the hip-hop influence in pop music. Hip-hop songs are often more direct lyrically than, let's say, your average power ballad, but what they lack in metaphor and universality, it makes up for in density and detail. XCX's style is clearly more indebted to hip-hop than to sung pop music, but at the same time, she's clearly not trying to be an authentic rapper by any stretch. Charli talks about hearing Pop the Glock by Uffy on MySpace and that being her gateway into wanting to make music.
Gonna make it to the top, spit this shit till you drop.
I don't know much about Uffy, but based on the stuff that I reviewed on this channel this year, there's one touch point that immediately came to mind with regards to precursors to XCX's vocal style, and that is Tina Weymouth from the Tom Tom Club.
Words to tell you what to do. Words are working hard for you.
Weymouth's style of rapping worked because she very much lent into how stiff and uptight she was about it, and so rather than seeming like she was trend chasing, it gave Tom Tom Club's sound a more fun and unexpected edge. And it's the same with Charli XCX. Vocally, it doesn't feel like she's trying to hide the fact that she's a middle-class woman from Essex. It does help a little that we're in the age of auto-tune, which is a tool that she's very much into, and unabashedly so.
I'm breaking up with you, 'cause I'm trying to hook up with your dad.
I will concede that for me, auto-tune is still a stumbling block when it comes to modern pop. I'd like to say it's just me being a boomer, but honestly, part of the reason I dislike a lot of that auto-tuned pop is that I just find the sound of it painful. I don't mind it when it's used in moderation, but it seems like there are artists who really use it in overpowering dollops. I asked my partner if there was something wrong with me for not being able to stomach too much auto-tune in one go, and she just said, yeah, it's your autism. So, you heard it here first, gang. Charli XCX, ableist confirmed. And the list of charges adds up on this front when you look at all of the lyric videos she put up for Brat, every single one of which comes with a seizure warning. I don't even get seizures, and I found most of them unwatchable. To be fair, I've seen a lot of strobing in music videos recently, from Rebecca Black, Halsey, Kneecap, Asking Alexandria. It does largely seem that pop stars have just agreed that epileptics are not a core demographic anymore. Or maybe there's a cure now, and no one told me. But that's enough about the lyrical content here. What about the production? Like many auteur pop albums in recent years, Brat is very much a group project, and yet everything from the team of producers here is funneled through into Charli's own vision. The most frequent name to come up on the producer credits here is A.G. Cook, a long-term collaborator with XCX as well as with the late great producer Sophie. Other recurring names here include Finn Keen, formerly known as Easy Fun, and a regular collaborator with A.G. Cook in the band Thy Slaughter. And then there's George Daniel, the drummer from the 1975 and Charli XCX's partner. Charli contributes to the production on a few of the tracks here, and then the rest of the producers tend to chip in for one or two tracks each. From these names there's a couple that I did recognise, one of whom was Hudson Mohawk, who has unexpectedly become known for instrumental sex jams in the modern age. But it makes sense given that his bouncy instrumental hip-hop and techno style has become part of the furniture somewhat in modern pop lore. Most surprising to me was seeing that Everything Is Romantic has a production credit from El Guincho. I probably shouldn't have been that surprised. He's done work for a lot of big hitters in experimental soul these last few years, like FKA Twigs, Bjork, Sampha, but he pretty much fell off my radar since I listened to his debut Alleganza back in 2008, a techno tropicalia album that blew me away at the time, although its fairly repetitive production style has meant it hasn't aged too well. But Everything Is Romantic starts with a garbled string section.
Bad tattoos on leather tan skin, Jesus Christ on a plastic sign.
And given the lack of anything like this in any other track, I think it's fair to say that this is his. It's one of the rare instances on this album where the production gestures towards actual instrumentation rather than electronic elements. Another instance of this is the unexpected piano on Mean Girls.
He knows that you're obsessed.
Which comes out of nowhere and is almost unnecessarily classy for this album, and yet it just works supremely well in this context. I think A.G. Cook is probably to blame for this. He just has this supreme eye for detail when it comes to the production on this album. I can't necessarily isolate every detail on this album that's his because it just isn't outlined that way, but every track with his name on it just always has at least one rug-pulling moment with the production. Brat is very much an ode to club music, and one of the things that jumps out at me with the production is that there's numerous references to devices in dance and rave music, but unlike some of the more derivative forces in that area, it's actually a little more subtle in how it uses them. For example, the opening track 360 has a chord sequence that, although it's not a sample, reminds me a lot of the chord progression in Music Sounds Better With You. In fact, the French touch references are rife throughout this album, like the keyboard on the chorus for Talk Talk, or the minimal repetitive house of B2B. Girl So Confusing has got that candy floss disco feel you get on Daft Punk's Discovery album.
It's so confusing sometimes to be a girl.
And just to tie this theory together properly, there is an actual explicit Daft Punk reference on Guess.
Touch it, bring it, pay it, watch it, turn it, leave it, stop, format it.
Try it, hide it, lick it, spit it, pull it to the side and get all up in it.
And then of course there's just the general repetition of lyrical refrains throughout the album. I hear echoes of Naughty's dance staples in other tracks though, like the Power Tool synth in Von Dutch, which reminds me a lot of Body Rox's Yeah Yeah. And then there's the big bass stomper of the initial release's final track 365, which almost teeters on Satisfaction by Benny Benassi. The synths on Mean Girls have a kind of soft cell tainted love feel to them.
Yeah, she's in her mid-20s, real intelligent, hedonistic with the gravel drool and dead eyes.
Yeah, I know that's an 80s song, but Rihanna sampled it, so it fits with the Naughties theme. Rather than outright sampling any of these elements though, it basically just seems to allude to them, which makes things a lot more interesting. Now, did this album make me into a Charli XCX convert? I wouldn't go that far. There are a lot of overtly saccharine elements to numerous tracks which I struggle to digest. And then of course there's the auto-tune, which as much as I think XCX uses it well on this album, it's always going to be a bit of a sore point for me. But as a primer on Charli XCX, this definitely made me interested. It's the most that I can recall listening to a quote-unquote pop album in recent years without feeling like it was work to do so. And in terms of how this record sets itself up for a remix project, I feel that DNA is already inherent in Brat. You've got 365 at the end, which is already a repetition of the album's opener 360, taking the original's melody and pitching it up a semitone.
Gonna jump when it drops when I'm hitting that. Dial 999, it's a good time. Who the f-
It's that rare instance of a key change in modern pop, although you do have to wait an entire album for it to arise. Even before that, you've got the track Rewind, which sounds like it's retooling 360's melody, but into a chord sequence that's a little closer to something like Katy Perry's California Girls.
Back in time to when I wasn't insecure, to when I
And the whole premise of that song is about wanting to rewind, so thematically it seems fitting that there is a recurring melodic device, almost a leitmotif throughout this album. One of the things that does jump out of me with Brat though is, as collaborative as Charli is with producers, vocally this is very much a solo album. There's no guest features on vocals here, and if there are any additional vocals they do seem to be very subtly implemented. So when it comes to remixing Brat, I could imagine the modern industry person thinking, well, let's just get a bunch of guest vocalists in. Is that what happened?
You always say let's go out, but then I'd cancel last minute. I was so
A few months ago, I read an article from The Guardian by Ben Cardew titled, "From topping the 90s charts to very controlled and predictable today, is the remix dead?" I thought about doing a video about this article, given that I spent this entire year trying to set up a YouTube channel specifically dedicated to reviewing remix content, and now some music critic is suggesting that my efforts might have been worthless. Like most questions in headlines, this was clickbait, of course, and in actual fact, there wasn't really a huge amount in this article that I disagreed with. The basic point of Cardew's article is that in the 90s, producer-based remixes had a lot of clout in the mainstream, with the likes of Norman Cook, Armand Van Helden, Todd Terry and Jason Nevins being able to launch ignored or forgotten rock, hip-hop and soul tracks into chart success by giving them a dance makeover. Whereas now in the 20s that pretty much never happens. This point is indisputably true. I do disagree with Cardew's assertion that remixes in the 90s were inherently more creative. Several of the examples he cites were either just tracks that had a dance beat thrown underneath them, or tracks where the producer took 1 second of the original and repeated it to buggery. There is one line from this Cardew article though that really stuck with me when it came to assessing the modern landscape for remixes. Nowadays, the only remixes getting traction tend to be when a new verse is added to a rap or pop track, often simply to reinvigorate streamings and contribute to the song's chart placing. Brat, and it's completely different but also still Brat, seems very much aware of this remix climate. For one, she's largely stopped short of saying that this is a remix project on numerous occasions, seemingly aware of the knee-jerk eye roll that often follows such a phrase.
The remix album, again, I don't
It's
really
a
know
new
if it's
album.
called that.
It's a new album.
Yeah, it's kind of a new album, isn't it? Yeah.
It's like,
She seems at least relatively content to let people figure it out for themselves. Then there's the most attention-grabbing aspect of Still Brat, which is the cast list. Quite possibly one of the most star-studded ever to be applied to a remix project. However, the vast majority of artists listed here are known as vocalists, so if anyone looked at the track list and assumed it was going to be just a bunch of guest verses, then they could very much be forgiven for it. As it stands though, there's only really 4 tracks on Still Brat that come across as the original production just with extra vocals on it. The opening remix of 360 featuring Young Lean and Robin is one such example, and perhaps it's deliberately like that in order to wrong foot people into thinking the rest of the album is going to be along these lines. It's probably the weakest out of these 4 tracks for me, as it takes the playful awkwardness of Charli's original flexes and turns it into something resembling a straight-faced Lonely Island. And to be fair, she did get to work with Andy Samberg, so it was a successful audition. There are some lyrics here that seem accidentally bad rather than knowingly bad, such as when Young Lean says, We do have to remember that Elvis had numerous moments in his life worth speaking of, some less desirable than others. You've then got Robin, who comes in with probably the biggest non sequitur on the entire album.
I started so young I didn't even have email, now my lyrics on your booby.
Did I just turn over 2 pages at once? And then towards the end, Young Lean goes into a bragging list of all the things that he has. Stuff like family and pets and drinks, which all seem like they'd reside somewhere lower on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I don't know, as far as making a beta posse cut goes, it's kinda cute, but I think it maybe gets too stupid at points. Conceptually, the remix of Girl So Confusing is, for my money, one of the more inspired takes on this album. The original version of the song was widely theorised to be about the pop star Lorde, through the lens of how the media seems to salivate at the thought of putting women up against each other, as if they're in some sort of emotional coliseum. For the remix, Charli managed to cleverly complicate matters by actually convincing Lorde to do a guest verse on the track, to express things from her perspective.
I was trapped in hatred and your life seemed so awesome. I never thought for a second my voice was in your head.
It's one of many great examples on this album of how guest verses can actually provide interesting counter-narratives or alternative perspectives on the subject of the song. Having said that, the remix of Spring Breakers does largely feel like a hey we got Kesha kind of remix, but quite honestly it works supremely well. The original was one of the bonus tracks on the initial deluxe version of Brat.
Vroom, 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 vroom in a big pink truck. February 10th and I'm gonna pull up. Hey, Staples Center, what the fuck is that?
And although it's decently carried by Charli's performance and A.G. Cook's immense production, there's something about Kesha's down-to-earth sass that really enlivens this track.
Ooh, these bitches rip off. Wish they could be OG, they not. We going psycho, we going off.
The single most effective guest verse remix on this album, though, for me is Guess. Yeah, go on, Guess. Yeah, you're right, it is Guess. I'm going to come out and say that the original Guess is the weak link of the Brat project, and I would largely put this down to the production of The Dare. I've ranted about this clown before as part of my Water From Your Eyes video this year, but he's an exceedingly average electro-clash producer who's decided that the best way to make up for his terminal midness is to both dress and act like an enemy journalist wet dream. And given that he's part of one of the biggest pop albums of the year and gets an actual shout out from Charli herself, seems like it's worked. The production on Guess is fine. Honestly, it's fine, but in the context of an album with elaborate club deconstructions from A.G. Cook, Finn Keen and others, the backing he creates here feels really underdeveloped in comparison.
Where you wanna know what I got going on down there? Is it pretty in pink?
It's the only track from the entire Brat project that actually sounds kind of unfinished. Or it did, until they got Billie Eilish on it.
Guess the color of your underwear. Already know what you got going on down there.
Yep, it turned out the one thing missing from this track was a husky voice off. Billie wins hands down. For all that I've dissed the Dare's input here though, the contrast in Billie and Charli's voices works so well on this version because the production is so stark. Whereas if they were working with one of the busier instrumentals, then that dynamic might have been lost. Which begs the question, was the remixed version of Guess the plan all along? After all, Charli did say, so maybe the original was almost just an appetizer for Still Brat. Think about it. There's a production credit here for Eilish's brother Phineas, even though the instrumental seems to be largely identical to that of the original. I'm guessing he maybe did a bit of extra programming on Billie's vocals or something. I just did. But whatever it was, that additional alchemy is undeniable. The remaining 13 remixes on this project all have at least some significant musical tweaking to them of note. One of the things that makes Brat's status as a remix album ambiguous is the fact that, with one exception, none of the titles here feature the word remix. To some extent this makes sense, as many of the guests here are just doing vocal features on the album. But then you've got the likes of John Hopkins, The Japanese House, Julian Casablancas and Bon Iver, all of which have production credits on the tracks they remix but are still just credited as features. And then you've got producers who appear exclusively on the remix version of tracks who don't even get a look in on the title. You've got Tim from the House on the remix of Club Classics, and I don't know exactly what his contributions are, but it goes from this big stomping kick drum and melted trance synths of the original
When I go to the club, I wanna hear those club classics. Club classics.
to almost being a bonsai two-step track.
When I go to the club, I wanna hear those club classics. It's like when I'm in the club, yeah, I'm bumping that.
And yet, as far as personnel goes, the title simply credits BB Tricks, who provides, as far as I can tell, little more than a guest verse in Spanish. The Troye Sivan version of Talk Talk has 3 extra producers credited on it, all of whom are previous collaborators with Sivan, and yet the title simply credits Troye Sivan as if it's a band name like Lucas Graham. Finn Keen is credited with extra production to a bunch of these remixes, and although he's clearly a significant part of Charli's team alongside A.G. Cook, he never explicitly gets a featuring nod, unlike Cook. Am I splitting hairs here? Maybe. Keen doesn't have anywhere near the profile of Cook, and maybe he doesn't want it. This music video was the closest I could get to any footage of him, and half the time he appears to be wrapped in baby vomit. We're operating in an era of remix skepticism, and Charli is probably right in that posting a long, dispassionate list of remix producers would probably be both off-putting and potentially alienating to fans. And yet, the Ben Cardew article I talked about earlier does mention how artists don't really seem to be known specifically as remixers anymore, and maybe the production fan in me is just kind of bristling a little bit. Especially since that for all Still Brat's emphasis on the vocal guest stars, this is very much a producer's remix album. For example, Caroline Polachek may be the vocal presence that keeps the remix of Everything is Romantic on the Straight and Narrow, with her lyrics about the chaos of city noise offering an ironic counterpoint to the original's hymn tune Romanticism.
Sleepyhead, cause all the fucking foxes kept me awake last night.
But it's the way that the production has been shifted into this melancholic half-step groove that really solidifies this remix as one of the better ones for me.
You would relate. I feel smothered by logistics. Need my fingerprints on everything, trying to feed my relation.
The remix of 365 has Shy Girl doing one of her typically dirty verses, which sonically at least blends in really well with Charli's vocals.
Too hot when I sweat, just lick me, touch and squeeze and the baseline hits me.
But for me, it's the brooding bass line and these truly evil early 90s rave chords that really take centre stage here, taking an already gnarly track and pushing it into even more ridiculous territory. Having said that though, not all of these moments of reproduction really land for me. The A.G. Cook remix of Von Dutch takes the circular saw riff of the original and turns it into something faster, higher pitched and warmer, which gives it a surprisingly cozy backing for Addison Rae's lifestyle flexes.
Made another page just to look at my pics, my tight dress and red lips. I know you want it, I'm just living that life.
There's an outro where the power tool noises just started flying all over the place as if the workshop has been haunted. And I do quite like how hard this goes, but personally I think the more focused riffage of the original works better. Then there's Rewind, whereby the original references wanting to rewind and illustrates that particularly unsubtly with repeated use of a backspin sound effect. It's like, come on Charli, leave that stuff to the DJ. You've got to give us something to do. The remix though takes the theme of rewinding to its logical conclusion by having significant waves of the instrumentation reversed.
Sometimes I just wanna rewind, wanna turn back time to a different time.
They didn't go as far as playing the whole track backwards, which might have been a step too far. But there are other irritants in it, like the vocal processing towards the end, which makes Charli sound like Madeline from Celeste. Then there's the remix of B2B, which conceptually feels like one of the more tenuous ones on this album, on which Finn Keen and Leon reject the slow house of the original for a upbeat, poppy, breakbeat groove that, to be honest, doesn't do much that the rest of Brat doesn't already do better. It also features a guest verse from Tinashe, who mainly seems to be there so that Charli can show that she knows Tinashe. Her lyrics are about her busy schedule and how both her and Charli have been bubbling under for longer than people may assume.
Didn't come out of nowhere. They been sleeping on me, I'm bored.
But in relation to any of the original themes of the track, this one feels pretty extracurricular. Then there's the Japanese House's remix of Apple, which seems to simplify and smother the elements of the original into something softer and more emotionally broad. The original has fun moments like Charli repeating the refrain airport in a beautifully asinine manner. Here the specific details are pared back somewhat. And this is often a key thing that dictates whether I enjoy the remix more than the original on this album. Generally feels to me like the more specific the version of the track, the more I like it. For example, the remix of Sympathy as a Knife featuring Ariana Grande is lyrically pretty upfront about how the expectations of Charli have changed since she has now become more or less famous. Her and Grande dole out a list of neuroses that feel a lot more relatable to me.
Why should you explain? Use the knife when the mean fans hate the nice fans.
And the production gets a lot more elaborate to match, initially starting more subtle, but then going into these squelchy laser sword noises. Sometimes the specificity works against the remix though. The Troye Sivan version of Talk Talk responds to the shyness of Charli's original with a much more confident, plan-based attitude to a potential partner.
Okay, here's the plan. I wanna fly you out to Amsterdam. I gotta be her to fuck you and I wanna...
Which doesn't feel as interesting to me given that shyness feels almost like a dying art in pop music. Apart from Shy Girl, of course, the shyness ambassador. Although weirdly, given the number of producers on this remix, the actual overall effect of the production does seem shyer than that of the original. In the instances where the features also have production credits on this album though, these result in some of the most radical overhauls on Still Brat. On the Bon Iver remix of I Think About It All the Time, for example, the new production elements he adds seem to be very heavily indebted to 80s adult contemporary music. You've got his aching croons, which I can't deny are pretty Moorish, but as well done as it is, that's really not my vibe. It also zones in on some of the more broad emotional aspects of the original song, rather than the specific details, although that said, there is a section where Charli talks about album cycles.
First off, you're bound to the album, then you're locked into the promo. Next thing, 3 years have gone by.
I have no interest in having kids and no album to promote, so I should probably abstain from this one. There's the remix of I Might Say Something Stupid by John Hopkins in the 1975, and I already like the original version of this. It's a short little Rhodes-backed ballad. It reminds me of Radiohead's Kid A of all things.
I don't feel like nothing special. I snag my tights out on the lawn chair.
It's one of the album's only real deviations from the club aesthetic, and the remix goes even further in that direction. This 4-minute track has some of the most spacious production on the entire album, with this repeated off-kilter piano refrain that reminds me quite a bit of Nils Fram.
I could say something small.
There's bits of violin, a guitar, and a light rock stomp that eventually comes in, but isn't particularly overpowering.
Raw in my house in LA, thinking of giving up everything.
It's a really odd, unusual structure for a track here, and Matty Healy's vocals fit really well over it. Like Charli, he's someone who has now reached a level of fame where stuff that he's said in interviews and on social media can come back to haunt him.
What do you think is like your least attractive trait that you have?
Probably my personality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's a real vulnerability about the way that he sings about this stuff, which reminds me of Mark Hollis's vocals from Talk Talk's Laughing Stock.
I don't know if I belong here.
Do you remember when Talk Talk was a band rather than a song or a telecoms company? Great days. In terms of emotional heft though, one of the most effective tracks on this album for me was the A.G. Cook version of So I. The original is dedicated to Sophie and is a heartfelt ballad in which Charli expresses regrets over not having spent more time with her friend before she passed away. It's clearly a very cathartic piece, but the production leaves me a little bit cold on this take, with a synth sound that reminds me of the Temper Trap. And this big synth bass that sounds like the 80s but with gigantism.
I was scared sometimes. You had a power like a lightning strike.
There are also lyrics like Always on My Mind, which, as much as I'm sure it's true for Charli, sounds oddly stock considering how specific the rest of this album goes. I am willing to put this down to having a particularly fraught relationship with bereavement over the course of my life, so I suspect these criticisms probably say much more about me than they do the song, but I absolutely love the remix. Cook completely flips the vibe of the original, making it faster, more upbeat, more major key, and ultimately more in line with the kind of hyperpop sound that Sophie helped to give birth to. You even get a bit of a penny whistle sound at the beginning, which I believe is possibly a sample from Sophie herself. And there's these wonderful bits and bobs throughout that just sound like her spirit has woken up and taken over the track. And lyrically, we're delving into specificity again as Charli goes over all the good times that she can remember she spent with Sophie.
Now I wanna think about all the good times. Best night ever in Arco Santi. So many friends right there in the audience. When I look back, what the fuck was I wearing now?
It's an absolutely beautiful tribute to Sophie, but also one with a bittersweet end, as it ends on these scraping drums that have something of a morbid feel to them as closing sounds go. It is one of the most innovative remixes on this package for my money, but in terms of experimentation, I'd say the person who goes the furthest is Julian Casablancas with his remix of Mean Girls. It focuses on the piano sample, easily one of the biggest outliers on the original Brat album, and turns that into the main refrain of this remix, placing it over a light breakbeat that sounds like it was played on a Tupperware lid, and throwing in a bunch of new synths and guitar in order to make it this lo-fi alt-rock patchwork.
And now you're at my door. I've seen this trick before. This one's for all my me.
And there are some odd interpolations in Casablanca's vocals, such as the main refrain that, as many people have pointed out, is clearly a nod to Owner of a Lonely Heart by Yes. There's also a bit that samples Herbie Hancock's Secret Sauce, almost seemingly for no reason. On paper, this should be the remix that I respect the most on this album. In practice, it is probably the worst remix I've heard all year, because as much as these ideas are all pretty left field, sonically they all sound hideous. I have no idea why anyone ever thought Casablancas sound good when he globs on the auto-tune. I hated it on his Daft Punk collaboration, I hated it on his Voids album this year, and my god do I hate it here. And for all that the production offers a detour from the shimmering space race of the rest of the project, there's something almost amateurish and even incompetent about the way this has been put together.
Get all away in front
Even lyrically, this one hits me wrong, with Casablancas hijacking almost the entire track and making it about him. I don't want to hear Julian Casablancas singing about women on a song about mean girls. Like, this is the song you should have got Tinashe to do a guest verse on. At any rate though, that is Still Brat, an album that looks set to become a milestone in remixing for a number of reasons. Some of which are good, some of which perhaps less so. Ultimately, this feels like a remix album where if a pop artist in the future is going to take the most interesting lessons from this project, then maybe remixing will cease to be a dirty word and will become a celebrated part of pop culture again, just like Ben Karji wanted. That said, there does also feel like a risk that all pop remix albums going forward will just be a cavalcade of guest vocalists and anonymous producers slapdashly thrown together in the hope of creating something with anywhere near the majesty of this project. More than anything else though, Still Brat gave me an experience that I didn't get from any other remix album this year, and that was an album whose relationship to the original felt almost symbiotic. I came away from this experience feeling like you couldn't have Still Brat without Brat, and equally, I don't think you can have Brat without Still Brat either. Between the two of them, you get a spaghetti junction of lore and a multiverse of musical possibilities that ultimately relies on each other for its strength. Although that isn't to say there weren't standout tracks in the journey, and I definitely have a few favourites from this project. The honourable mentions for me go to the remixes of club classics, Everything is Romantic, and I Might Say Something Stupid, all of which push the originals into musically and lyrically sumptuous new territory for me. But ultimately, it's the A.G. Cook remix of So I that caught me off guard the most on this album. The original version, emotional as it was, didn't make me cry, but this remix of it did. My least favourite remix, quite obviously, was the Julian Casablancas one, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't kind of wish this album had a little more of the anarchic spirit of this track in it, but I would have much preferred that spirit from an artist whose ear for aesthetics wasn't so garbled and horrible. And is Still Brat better than Brat? Kinda. Sometimes it throws out additional storytelling and new musical approaches to the tracks that really make me consider what the original song meant. Other times I feel it oversimplifies things and files off some of the edges. And as much as I said this was a producer's remix album, there is a part of me that wished that there were at least a few more remixes that went more off-road with the production here. Pitchfork mentioned in an article a list of dream collaborators they would have liked to have seen on Still Brat, and I had to concede it's a pretty solid list in terms of offering something a bit more out there. But still, for all my grumbles here, I've got to say, if Still Brat ends up being the biggest remix album of the decade, then I cannot deny that it absolutely deserves it. So that is my review of Brat, and it's completely different but also still Brat. Do you agree with my assessment? Disagree with my assessment? No opinions on my assessment? Let me know in the comments below. Do let me know about any other remix albums you think I should review in future, and please do subscribe if you'd like to see more remix-based content. Thank you very much for watching. This review is over.
Right now, right now, right now, right now, right now, right now.
It's there.